Welcome to Orashola Stories. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and comment. The first time I stepped into the Osifo mansion, I didn't feel lucky, I felt small. Everything was marble, crystal, and silence. The hallways echoed with the weight of money, the kind of wealth that swallows people like me whole. I was 23, orphaned at 19, with no siblings, no inheritance, no one even bothering to remember my birthday. Getting a job as a maid in billionaire Anthony Osifo's home was considered a miracle by the women at the agency, but for me, it was survival. I didn't care if I was cleaning toilets or polishing gold taps. I needed money for rent, food, and to keep my sanity. I was quiet, focused, and didn't ask questions. I avoided eye contact with the other staff and certainly avoided the man they all called the Lion. Mr. Osifo rarely came out of his study, but when he did, the house would fall into a nervous hush. I once saw him in passing, tall, dark-skinned, with a commanding presence and eyes that looked like they had seen the worst of life. He didn't smile, and he never repeated himself. But he paid well and on time, so I minded my business, kept my head down, and did my job with robotic precision. Despite my efforts to remain invisible, something about me began to draw his attention. Maybe it was the way I cried while sweeping, my tears dripping onto the polished floors like guilt I couldn't scrub away. Or maybe it was the bruises, faint but noticeable, on my arms and jaw, which I tried desperately to hide under long sleeves and carefully positioned scarves. The truth is, I had become a ticking time bomb of fear and silence. Every morning, I'd walk through the towering gates, carrying with me the weight of another night spent staring at my peeling ceiling, wondering if I'd survive the next encounter. Every task I performed was done with trembling hands, wiping mirrors, folding towels, watering the flowers that were better cared for than I was. The other staff noticed my withdrawal but said nothing. Maybe they thought I was just broken like so many other girls who'd passed through those halls. But Mr. Osifo, he noticed. I'd catch him sometimes, watching me from a distance, his sharp eyes narrowing with curiosity, suspicion, or maybe concern. I never lingered long enough to find out. I didn't want anyone to know how close I was to breaking. Still, the mansion, for all its luxury, became a prison of its own. I had learned how to move through it like a ghost, careful not to disturb its perfection. I never imagined that one day, the very person I feared noticing me would become the one person capable of saving me. But in those early days, I didn't see him as a savior. To me, he was just a symbol of everything I'd never have: power, protection, freedom. And I was terrified he would soon see through me, discover that I was not just a maid with a troubled past, but a girl living a double life, coerced into becoming the pawn in a deadly game I never asked to play. Because outside those gates, beyond the polished floors and chandeliers, danger awaited me every night. 3 men who watched my every move, who knew I worked for Anthony Osifo, and who threatened to kill me if I didn't give them what they wanted: access to him. I hadn't told a soul, not even my reflection, but the tears I shed while scrubbing his floors, they held the truth I didn't dare speak. And he was beginning to listen. The first time they approached me, I thought they were just catcallers, the kind of aggressive men who whistled or stared too long when I walked by in my faded jeans and oversized hoodie. I was on my way home from work, walking the narrow path near a half-fallen fence behind the mechanic's shop, the only shortcut I could take to avoid the drunken boys near the main road. The black car appeared from nowhere. Not flashy, just clean enough to say, someone important, and tinted just enough to say, someone dangerous. It pulled up slowly beside me, rolling at my pace. I tried not to look, tried to pretend I didn't hear the window roll down, but then came the voice. Cold, confident, deadly. Miriam. My feet stopped before I could process why. No one was supposed to know my name out here. I turned slowly and saw him, the man in the passenger seat with a snake-like smirk and deep tribal scars along his jaw. You work for Anthony Osifo, he said like it was a fact, not a question. And then he said the thing that made my stomach drop to my ankles. We need you to do something for us, unless you want your next of kin planning your funeral. My mouth went dry, my thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. I had no next of kin. No one would miss me if I died. Maybe they knew that. Maybe that's why they chose me. The man reached out the window and tossed a small, cheap phone into my bag. You'll answer when we call. You'll tell us where he sleeps, when he leaves, and how we can get past the cameras. I shook my head before I could stop myself. I can't. I don't. He leaned out the window just enough to make me flinch. Yes, you can. You will. And just like that, the car sped off, leaving me trembling on the roadside. I walked home like a ghost that night, the phone burning a hole in my bag. I didn't answer when it rang the first time. But then, 2 nights later, they came back. This time, on foot. And when I told them I had nothing to give, the man with the scar slapped me so hard my teeth rattled. Don't play smart. We're always watching. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a threat. It was a death sentence with my name on it. From that night onward, fear became my roommate. I barely slept. I double-locked my door even though it barely held. I kept knives under my pillow and prayed to a God I wasn't sure was listening anymore. But each morning, I showed up at Mr. Osifo's mansion like nothing was wrong. I cleaned the mirrors, ironed his shirts, and arranged his cutlery in straight lines while my hands shook and my mind raced. The phone rang once every 2 nights. I never answered, and when I didn't answer, they came. Sometimes it was words, sometimes fists, and every time, I begged God to make them go away. I thought about telling someone, maybe the head of security, but what if the men were watching? What if they killed me before I got the words out? My body was beginning to fail me. I worked slower, my bruises became harder to hide. But the worst part wasn't the pain, it was the shame. The feeling that somehow, this was my fault. That maybe if I hadn't taken this job, if I hadn't stepped into that mansion, I wouldn't be living in constant fear. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a tiny voice kept whispering, tell him. Just tell him. But I couldn't, because what if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was part of it? The bruises began to bloom like poisonous flowers across my skin, purple on my arms, yellowing around my ribs, and one red-hot welt on my cheek that refused to fade. I did everything I could to hide them. Thick scarves, long sleeves, heavy foundation that barely matched my skin tone. But you can't hide pain in your eyes. Not forever. One morning, while polishing the dining room table, I felt him standing behind me before I even saw him. Anthony Osifo didn't speak immediately. He had a habit of observing people silently, letting the silence speak louder than his voice ever could. You've been crying, he finally said. His voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't cold either. I froze, cloth still in hand. No, sir, I'm just tired, I lied. You were tired yesterday too. And the day before. I didn't respond. My hands were shaking. I prayed he wouldn't notice. But then I felt his eyes on my neck, the part of the scarf that had shifted, revealing the edge of a dark bruise. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. Who's hurting you? My first instinct was to lie. My second was to run. But both felt impossible. My voice came out as a whisper. It's nothing. I just had an accident. It was the worst lie of all, and we both knew it. But to my surprise, he didn't press further. He simply nodded and walked away. I didn't see him for the rest of the day. I thought maybe he'd gotten bored of trying to figure me out. Maybe he'd already dismissed me as another girl with baggage. But later that night, when I was leaving, I noticed something strange. His car, which was usually parked, was gone. I told myself it was nothing, that rich men had places to go. But the air felt heavier than usual, like a storm was coming. And in my gut, something told me, he knew more than he let on. What I didn't know was that Anthony Osifo had a rule: never act without certainty. He didn't confront unless he had proof. That night, while I walked home through the narrow, dimly lit alley near my shack, he followed in silence. He parked far enough to not be seen, and he watched. Watched as 3 shadows emerged from the corner. Watched as one of them grabbed me by the arm, hissed threats into my ear, and slapped me hard enough to send me stumbling backward. He saw it all, and he didn't step in. He didn't make a sound. He waited, then drove off quietly. Not because he didn't care, but because he had made a decision. This wasn't just an employee in trouble. This was something bigger, something darker, and if he was going to fix it, he had to do it his way. That night, I didn't sleep. The sting of the slap still burned on my cheek, and the echo of their threats kept replaying in my mind. I tried to convince myself that I could endure this, that if I just kept silent, kept stalling, maybe they would get tired and disappear. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. They were getting more aggressive, desperate, and sooner or later, they'd stop asking and start taking. I looked around my tiny room, bare walls, leaking ceiling, a mattress that felt more like folded cardboard, and realized I had no escape plan. I didn't even have credit on my phone to call for help. Not that I had anyone to call, so I did what I'd done every other night. Curled into a ball, buried my bruises under a thin blanket, and prayed that tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. The next morning, I arrived at the mansion late. No one scolded me, but the air felt different, almost still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I kept my head down and started my chores, expecting Mr. Osifo to ignore me as usual. But then his voice rang out from the hallway, "Miriam, come." I followed him into the study. It was the first time I had been inside. The room smelled like expensive leather and old paper. He didn't ask me to sit. He didn't look at me either. Instead, he stood facing the window and said, "You're not going back to that place tonight." My heart nearly stopped. "Sir?" I asked, confused. He turned then, eyes calm but unreadable. "You'll stay here, in one of the guest rooms. Starting today." I blinked, unsure if I heard him right. "I can't. I don't want to impose." His voice dropped. "Miriam, it's not a request." I stood frozen, overwhelmed by confusion and fear. How much did he know? Why was he doing this? And why now? Before I could protest further, he added, "I saw them last night." My stomach dropped. My knees buckled slightly. He had seen them. He had followed me. My secrets were no longer hidden. My shame, my bruises, my pain, he had seen it all. And yet, he wasn't angry. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't even curious. He was calm, collected, focused. "Let me deal with them," he said quietly. "But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" And for the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar swell in my chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was hope. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, for once, but because my mind couldn't process what was happening. Mr. Osifo had seen everything. The beatings, the threats, the life I was trying so hard to keep hidden beneath scarves and silence. And instead of firing me or reporting me, he had offered me shelter. Real, safe shelter. A guest room in his mansion, soft bed, locked doors, guarded walls. It felt surreal. For a girl like me, used to cement floors and whispered threats through broken windows, it felt too good to be true. I kept waiting for the catch. For him to yell, to accuse me of betrayal, to ask why I didn't speak up sooner. But he never did. That morning, he handed me a fresh keycard and said, "Your room has been prepared. You don't leave the compound without telling me." There was no room for argument in his voice. I nodded like a child, clutching the card with shaking fingers. Later that day, he called me into the garden, not to lecture me, but to talk. "They're not ordinary criminals," he said. "They've tried to come for me before, through people I trusted." I looked at him, startled. He wasn't just protecting me. He was connecting dots. "So you think they're using me to get to you?" I asked. He nodded, his jaw tense. "But they made a mistake," he said. "They think you're alone." The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable. He sat down across from me, eyes sharp but kind. "Miriam, if you help me, we can stop them. Together." I stared at him, unsure. I was just a maid, a girl barely surviving. But in that moment, something in his gaze told me I wasn't just a victim. I was a piece of the puzzle. A key witness, a target turned weapon. I nodded slowly, terrified but determined. "I'll help you." And from that moment on, the game changed. I was no longer just cleaning his floors. I was standing beside him, planning the takedown of the very men who tried to use me. The plan was simple, but the stakes were deadly. I was to lie, boldly, convincingly, to the very men who had threatened to kill me if I didn't help them kill Anthony Osifo. I would tell them what they wanted to hear, that I finally had access to his private schedule, that the security lights would be off at midnight, and that he'd be alone in the east wing of the house, completely unguarded. It sounded real, dangerous, perfect, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my stomach felt like a pit of acid. This wasn't like mopping floors or dusting portraits. This was war, and I was the bait. Anthony gave me full control of how the message would be delivered. Let them feel in charge, he said. Let them believe you've surrendered. But I hadn't surrendered. I had transformed. The frightened girl who used to shrink under their gaze now sat across from Nigeria's most feared billionaire, planning an ambush that could get all of us killed if anything went wrong. His security team, silent men with wired ears and emotionless faces, mapped out the ambush around the estate. They called it Operation Midnight Net. It sounded like something out of a movie. But this wasn't a movie. This was my life, and if I made even the slightest mistake, they wouldn't just punish me. They'd come after him, too. The night before the trap, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my guest room and stared at my reflection. The bruises were fading now, but the fear lingered in my eyes. I thought about running, thought about disappearing into the slums and never looking back. But then I remembered the way Anthony had looked at me when I told him the truth. No judgment, no pity, just quiet resolve. He believed me, he protected me, and now, I had a chance to return the favor. So I picked up the burner phone and dialed. It rang once before being answered. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice low and broken. "He'll be alone tomorrow. East Wing. No guards. No lights. I'll leave the back gate open." The line went silent, and then came a whisper, "Good girl." I hung up and nearly collapsed from the weight of it all. But I didn't cry, not this time. Instead, I got up the next morning and helped set the trap with Anthony's security team. Every corner of the East Wing was wired. The cameras were hidden, the alarms disarmed temporarily, and 10 armed men were stationed in shadows with sniper-like precision. Midnight was the hour. I stayed in my room as instructed, pacing, sweating, praying. When the clock struck 12, the alarms in my mind went off. I didn't hear gunshots, just a sharp thud, a scream, then silence. 30 minutes later, Anthony knocked on my door. "It's done," he said. His face was unreadable. "They'll never touch you again." I broke down, not from fear, but from relief. For the first time since I'd started this nightmare, I felt safe. I thought it was over. But that was the mistake. The night after the takedown, I tried to sleep for the first time in what felt like years. The silence of the mansion wrapped around me like a blanket, heavy but oddly comforting. I kept telling myself, "They're gone, it's done." Yet deep down, a thread of unease still pulled at my chest. When Anthony knocked on my door the next morning, his face was strained. "We got 3 of them," he said slowly, but someone tipped him off before they came. They were expecting resistance. I sat upright. "What does that mean?" I asked, heart pounding. "It means," he replied, "someone else on the inside is feeding them." My blood turned to ice. I had always assumed the danger was from the outside, from strangers in the slums, men who lingered in alleys and struck in the dark. But now, the terror had a new face, someone inside this house. Someone who walked the same marbled halls, maybe even nodded politely when they passed me in the corridor. The thought made me sick. And Anthony was spiraling too. He didn't show it with words, but I could see it in the way he paced during meetings, how his eyes flickered at every sound. Trust had become a scarce commodity. Everyone was a suspect, even me. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered to the study. I found Anthony there, glass in hand, staring at the fire like it held all the answers. "I built this empire," he said, voice low, thinking power would keep me safe. But I was wrong. Power attracts predators. I sat beside him. We didn't speak for a while, just the sound of wood cracking in the fireplace. Then he leaned in. "Miriam, there's something you need to know. I didn't just take you in because I felt sorry for you." I blinked. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a photo. My breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of my father. I hadn't seen his face in years, but I'd know that expression anywhere. Strong, proud, protective. The way he always looked at me as a child. "How do you have this?" I whispered, stunned. Anthony's voice cracked for the first time since I met him. "Because your father worked for me. He saved my life once, years ago. And when he died, I swore if I ever found his daughter, I'd protect her. No matter what it cost." I felt like the ground beneath me had vanished. All this time, I thought I was just a maid, a frightened girl thrown into a world I didn't belong in. But the truth was deeper, older, bloodbound. And now I wasn't just in this for survival. I was in it to finish what my father started. I stared at the photograph for what felt like hours. My father, a man I thought had lived and died quietly, without ever brushing against the world of power. Yet here was Anthony, Nigeria's most elusive billionaire, telling me that my father had once saved his life. The room swam around me as I pieced it together. The way Anthony had treated me with quiet grace. The way he'd always looked at me, not just with concern, but with recognition. It all made sense now. But before I could ask another question, his phone buzzed sharply. He looked down, then up at me, face pale. "Miriam," he said slowly, "there's been a breach." We rushed to the surveillance room. A live feed was playing on one of the monitors. One of Anthony's closest aides, Paul, the ever-smiling operations manager who shook my hand every morning, was caught in the guest wing, speaking in hushed tones to someone on a burner phone. "He's the last one," Anthony muttered, eyes hardening. "The last snake in my house." My stomach turned. Paul, the man who had once helped me carry a tray of drinks when I nearly collapsed. The same Paul who'd prayed before meals and smiled like an uncle. I felt cold, betrayed, but what came next chilled me even more. Anthony wasn't planning to confront him yet. "No," he said when I asked. "We're going to let him lead us to whoever he answers to. The men we caught, they were pawns. Paul is a gatekeeper." I followed Anthony down the spiral stairs to the basement, where security was already preparing tracking devices and decoy plans. I watched him transform, from gentle, grieving guardian to a calculated strategist. "You still in?" he asked without looking at me. I didn't hesitate. Yes, I didn't just owe him. I owed my father. Whatever danger lay ahead, I would walk into it with my head held high. The plan was to keep Paul comfortable, unwatched, unbothered. He would assume the heat had passed, that we had moved on. For the next 2 days, I acted normal. Smiled at Paul, served his lunch, but every word he said echoed with venom now. On the third night, he left the mansion in a black car, unaware we had planted a tracker in the wheel well. Anthony and his guards followed from a safe distance while I monitored the feed. The car drove out of Lagos and into a secluded part of Ogun State. It stopped at a half-finished warehouse. Paul stepped out and entered, phone pressed to his ear. Then, like something out of a nightmare, I saw another man walk into view. Anthony's half-brother. Yes, the same half-brother who had once tried to take over his father's company. The one the tabloids claimed had disappeared overseas. He wasn't gone. He was here, planning Anthony's death, and using Paul as his inside man. I leaned back from the screen, heart in my throat. Anthony had suspected many enemies, but not this one. Not his own blood. Now we weren't just fighting to survive. We were preparing for war. When Anthony returned that night, he wasn't the same man. He looked like someone who had seen the ghost of his past rise from the grave. "Desmond," he said through clenched teeth. I should have known. His half-brother, Desmond, had once tried to forge documents and steal from their father's estate after his death. Anthony had been the one to expose him and have him exiled from the company. But exile wasn't enough, apparently. "He's been planning this for years," Anthony muttered. "Using Paul, using anyone who hated me enough to help him." He looked at me then, his eyes tired but burning. "We end this, soon." The next 24 hours were a blur of planning, surveillance, and silence. Anthony's private security tightened the perimeter. Miriam stayed close to him, not out of fear but out of loyalty. She had gone from the quiet maid to the trusted confidant. At one point, she asked him why he hadn't told her about Desmond earlier. Anthony's answer was brief but raw, because I never believed my own blood would want me dead. It wasn't just business anymore. It was personal, ancestral, a battle between two halves of the same family. And we were caught in the middle. By morning, Paul returned to the mansion, pretending nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The walls had ears. Cameras tracked every step. When he went to the West Wing for his usual afternoon meeting with suppliers, Anthony was waiting. Armed, calm. Paul froze. "You're not as smart as you think," Anthony said, voice sharp as steel. "You led me right to him." Paul dropped to his knees, begging for mercy. He offered names, locations, everything he knew. But Anthony didn't flinch. He had heard enough. "This house," he said, "was once full of ghosts. But not anymore." Paul was escorted out in cuffs. And the mansion exhaled. But Desmond was still out there. And he wasn't coming quietly. The sun had barely risen when the convoy pulled up to the warehouse. It was no longer just about Desmond or revenge. This was justice, for Anthony's father, for the lives nearly destroyed, and for the girl who had unknowingly been dragged into a blood feud. Miriam sat beside Anthony in the bulletproof SUV, her fingers interlocked tightly. She had traded fear for courage. No more hiding, no more tears while scrubbing marble floors. This was her fight now, too. And it was ending today. Anthony had coordinated with the police, the DSS, and his personal security. Everything was timed perfectly. Surveillance teams had confirmed Desmond's presence inside. Miriam watched from a mobile control room as live feeds poured in, Desmond giving orders to his guards, reviewing blueprints that showed the Osifo estate. He was planning a full siege, one officer whispered. Anthony said nothing. His silence was no longer weakness, it was thunder waiting to strike. Then came the breach. Flashbangs, shouts, and confusion ripped through the warehouse like a storm. Desmond tried to flee, but the law moved faster. He was tackled at the back exit, screaming Anthony's name like a curse. When Anthony finally stood face to face with his half-brother, there were no insults. No violence, just a look that said, "You lost." Desmond was dragged away in cuffs, his empire of lies crumbling behind him. Later that night, Miriam stood by the balcony of the mansion, looking out at the quiet city lights. Anthony joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You saved my life, Miriam," he said, voice low. More than once, she turned to him, her eyes no longer the eyes of a maid, but of a woman who had survived fire and chosen love. "And you gave me one," she replied. "A life worth something." A few months later, the media was flooded with wedding photos. Anthony Osifo, billionaire businessman, marrying his former maid in a private garden ceremony. But the headlines didn't know the full story. The war they had fought, the bond they had built, the lives they had reclaimed. And in the quiet corners of the mansion, where fear once lived, there was now only peace. And love. Thank you for watching. But that's not the end. The garden ceremony had been everything they dreamed it would be. Soft candlelight dancing among the roses, the scent of jasmine carried on a gentle breeze, and the hush of close family and friends witnessing their union. As Nigerian young Anthony slid the delicate gold band onto Nigerian young Miriam's finger, the world seemed to breathe with them. Birds stirred in the mango trees overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a lone flute played a lilting melody that felt composed just for this moment. Miriam's heart swelled so full it hurt. She could still feel the lingering warmth of Anthony's whispered vow that he would guard her from all harm, just as she had guarded his heart. After the final congratulations and tearful embraces, they slipped away from their guests. Under a canopy of fairy lights strung between ancient oaks, Anthony pressed a soft kiss to Miriam's temple. "Come with me," he murmured, offering his arm. They walked hand in hand down the stone path, leaving footprints in petals. Behind them, laughter and music drifted out into the night, a world they loved but no longer needed to inhabit. In that garden, beneath a sky ablaze with stars, they sealed not only a marriage but a promise, to build a life filled with safety, passion, and unwavering partnership. A month later, they found themselves on a private jet bound for the Maldives. Subscribe to our channel to get more interesting story like this. Thank you.